Hey everyone, what's going on? It's Tristan, and welcome back to the Tristan podcast, episode 5. I am back here with my ever faithful companion Tom. How's it going?
Yeah, it's as good as it gets when you're on the podcast, which is to say, amazing. It's amazing. It's amazing.
And it's always amazing to have you, and we're in for another fun episode, another amazing episode. We are doing part 2 of Lord of the Rings, which obviously we weren't expecting to be a series we do in parts, but I guess that's where we're at now. And since we only covered the first movie in an hour and 27 minutes last time we did Lord of the Rings, we are only going to be covering the second movie this time because if we did number 3 as well, which is the longest one of all of them with the most to talk about, then we'd be here probably for like 4 or 5 hours, which, look, I'm sure we'd be fine doing, but if we did that, then we'd probably be awake at like 3 o'clock in the morning, which we don't want to do. So, aside from that massive rant, we'll kick it off. We'll start again, sort of going chronologically through the second movie. We'll probably chuck in some few bits from the books and whatnot. Currently, I'm still like about 100 pages from finishing the second book, so there'll be a bit that I can't contribute to, but yeah. Anyway, let's kick us off, Tom. What have you got for number
I mean,
2?
before we even start number two, I think it's important to remember that last episode we finished saying that we had to discuss Aragorn because we did not mention him at all during the first part. So I think we'd better just spend a short time just covering Aragorn.
Okay,
And
perfect.
so I'm interested. How about you start with this? Anything specific that you want to say about Aragorn just at the beginning?
Um, he is probably one of the top two favorite characters for me. The other one fighting for in the top two is probably Sam. But yeah, Aragorn's definitely one of my favorites. I think the way they did him in the movies of how he's sort of like taking on that identity of like being king and not living in the past failures of his line is a very interesting sort of story arc they go on with him. I did like him in the books as well, where he sort of already was sure of himself and already sort of had accepted that lineage of being king. I also liked in the books how he already had the blade reforged from the first, like as soon as he left Rivendell. But they did it differently in the movie. It still worked. But yeah, easily one of my favorite characters. Absolute, like, just badass demonstration of a very strong and powerful character who's also very caring and loving. What about
Yeah,
you?
well, it's interesting when you discuss how in the books he's already accepted that role of him being king because Aragorn, as most people already know, is descended from the Númenóreans, who were in turn the race of men descended from someone called Elros, and Elros was the brother of Elrond, and
Yeah.
Elrond is Arwen's father. Now, Elrond and Elros are actually very interesting because they were actually born as half elves from as the children of an elf and a human. So they were given the choice as to which of the two lineages they would take up. So Elrond chooses to remain as an elf, and Elros chooses to remain as a man. And Elros's descendants become what were the Númenóreans. Then, just to breeze over most of the history, the Númenóreans move out of Middle Earth onto an island in the ocean called Númenor. Then they become corrupt. Sauron goes to Númenor. Lots of bad things happen. It's really depressing. It's really sad. And then Númenor gets destroyed, and then the survivors come back to Middle Earth. Now, the survivors of the Númenóreans set up two sort of main king. They set up well, it's one united kingdom at the start. You have Gondor and Arnor. So that's like the two sort of like I suppose the two halves of the United Kingdom. Then they split apart, and the High King over both Gondor and Arnor was Isildur. but Isildur obviously becomes corrupted by the ring and gets killed. So Aragorn is in fact descended directly from Isildur. So after Isildur dies, his nephew becomes the king of Gondor, and then his own descendants remain as the kings of Arnor, and then Gondor obviously gets passed on to the stewards, who continue to sort of rule it as a kingdom. Arnor uh, Arnor fragments into three kingdoms, which then each get destroyed in turn, and then the last king of Arnor ends up losing his. So the last king of Arnor ends up dying, and then his son becomes the chieftains of what would become the Dunedain, the Rangers of the North. So Aragorn is descended directly from that lineage, so he can trace his bloodline all the way back to Isildur, and from Isildur all the way back to Elros, who is Elrond's brother. Which is really funny when you consider the fact that Aragorn ends up marrying Arwen, who is Elrond's daughter. So Elrond has to watch the descendant of his brother marry his daughter.
Look, technically, if you think about it, they're like eighth or ninth cousins. Like
No, I
probably
agree.
much more. Probably much more. So
There's a very very large like generational gap,
yeah,
but
what
it
I
would still be
find, I think what's more weird is that Arwen's like what 1,000, 2,000 years old, and Aragon is like a young boy when he first comes to Rivendell. That is a bit
that is
more
true.
concerning for me,
It
in my
it
opinion.
is definitely a bit weird, but we've also got to keep in mind that the Aragorn and Arwen dynamic is supposed to be a sort of a it's meant to harken back to the Beren Luthien dynamic, and Beren and Luthien were another very very significant sort of relationship between a man Beren and then an elf woman who was
Mm.
Luthien. So it's supposed to be a callback to that. In fact, I believe there's a line somewhere in the books where Arwen is described as they say that there was no elf as beautiful as her since Luthien. And that's meant to be a very deliberate callback to the fact that Aragorn and Arwen are sort of like the new Beren and Luthien.
Mm.
And Beren and Luthien themselves played a key role in um in fighting Morgoth, who was Sauron's, well,
Yeah,
I suppose you could say Sauron's master
pretty much.
in a sense.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting how Aragorn represents a sort of he represents a he is the one that unites these like broken lineages of men and even elves back together.
Mm.
So
Mm.
so there's a lot of there's a very significant there's a huge amount of significance to his title as aside from him just being the heir of Isildur.
Mm.
And there's a huge amount of just it's actually really impressive when you look at what Tolkien was doing, just the amount of symbolism behind that.
Mm.
You can even link it into images of just like of well, you know, the return of a king. You could have an image of say you could have. I mean, Tolkien was Christian, so you have that image of like a king that was descended from a line, sort of coming and being sort of like the chosen one who'd sort of unite the world again. That's
Mm.
you could see that as a parallel to almost a Jesus figure, essentially.
Mm. Yeah. Which, yeah, I feel like the movies did well in terms of going into it as much as they could without overloading on the lore. But yeah, it was definitely something that we're thankful for the books to be able to have all that sort of information
Yeah.
and understanding on the character. Anyway, let's move into it because otherwise we'll be here for an hour and a half talking about Aragon. Um, all right, so end of number one, we've just left off with the Fellowship disbanded. Merry and Pippin have been taken by the Uruk-hai, who think they have, who Saruman has taken them because he thinks they have the ring. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are chasing after them, and then Frodo and Sam have now headed off in their own direction, heading towards Mordor. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with Merry and Pippin.
All right.
Start there.
Um, I think it's really something we get to see a bit more of their cunningness and cleverness when they've been captured. Um, Especially Pippin. You know, we don't really give him much credit, but like even him trying to give like a signal of to signal to Aragon and the others by like sort of chewing off his pin on his cloak, and even just how they try to seize the opportunity of escape when they do. It gives a bit more depth to their characters, which yeah, I thought was interesting. Although
Yeah,
yeah, we don't.
it's kind of like once they're out of the big group dynamic, you kind of
Mm,
have that opportunity to focus on them more.
yeah, like we've just sort of seen them as sort of the comedic relief in the first movie, but now they sort of get to grow into their own. We don't see them obviously captured by the Urukai for too long. Obviously, they escape pretty early on, then still continue on their own adventure. But yeah, that's at least what I get to what I start seeing when they've been sort of captured by the orcs, and even like Mary pretending that he's like passed out and sort of sick. I think that was even a credit to his sort of smarts. Um,
Mm,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, it's interesting how like once they're out of the group, they you sort of get to see them in a greater clarity, you sort of get a fuller picture. And I think I feel like the same can be said if you think of your well, of just when I say you, I mean just in general, like the general interactions that we have with people around us. When you're part of like if you're in like a big group dynamic, say maybe like 5, 6, 9 people, you know, you, it becomes hard to sort of make out the individual people within the group because the group kind of just becomes this one collective. But when you sort of take someone out of that group, you start to get a fuller idea of who they are. You start to observe elements of their personality, of their behavior, of even some of their different skills and talents that you don't notice when they're just part of this homogenous group. And I feel like the same principle is applied when we watch Merry and Pippin with the Urukai, because now that they're out of the Fellowship, now that we're not sort of distracted by everyone else, we're not, and we sort of see them in there just sort of just focusing in entirely on them and just watching their behavior, and it makes you realize also that their cunningness wasn't something that they developed. Like it was established very early on, even all the way in the Shire, that these were cheeky little hobbits. They did a lot of hilariously dumb things, and
and probably
seeing
wrong
them.
things.
Oh yes, that's true. But seeing them
It,
take those skills
mm,
and using it in a new way is I think a very interesting. I feel like it's an interesting message to us as an audience. I think it speaks. I think it's a message to how we should be viewing others. We can't if we're in like when we interact with people in just like massive groups, we can't limit our understanding of the individual members of that group to just how they are as part of the group. We need to be able to see beyond that and to expect that there'll be more beyond that. So even if we can't take them out of the group ourselves, we should at least be willing to expect that there's more to them than meets the eye.
mm, yeah, and yeah, I guess I'll talk about the scene now. The scene where they're sort of the orcs want to have a rest and sort of get the fire going. Um, yeah, for me, it's just an iconic scene, especially because you've got two iconic lines in that scene. One of which obviously being "looks like meat's back on the menu, boys." Like that just hits, even though that's literally them talking about cannibalism. And then I guess in terms of me and my family, one line that just has stuck out for us is um, when one of the orcs is asking about if they can eat Merry and Pippin, the other orc jumps in with a yeah, and it's just like it's an iconic, just that one word, like it just steals the show. Like it shows like just every single orc and orcai is sort of given a personality in that scene.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's great, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like, Merry and Pippin are individual personalities. The orcs and Uruk-hai are individual personalities of their own. Of course, those personalities come to a very graphic end a few scenes later.
Yeah, courtesy of Aomer and some of Rohan's finest. Uh,
Indeed.
yeah, and I guess sort of we'll talk about. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, the fact that we've got an 87-year-old, someone who's about 200 years old, and then another person who's about 1,000, 2,000 years old, all running non-stop for days, trying to chase this pack of Uruk-hai. And I guess this is where you sort of really get to see Aragorn's tracking skills come into play. We always see them a bit better later when he's investigating the campsite, but yeah, that's something that is really interesting, I guess, giving a different side to Aragorn.
Yeah, you're getting more of the ranger, of like
Mm,
the ranger coming out.
yeah, exactly. And then you also get some very nice lines from both Legolas and Gimli. Legolas being obviously the red sun rising, blood has been spilled this night. So every time you see a red sun in the morning, someone's died, just in case you didn't know that. And then Gimli also, of course, even talking about how dwarves are more dangerous over short distances. And then, of course, the iconic line of Legolas, they're taking the hobbits to Isengard, which, of
Mm.
course, inspired a great song.
I mean, even Aragorn just going, Legolas, what do your elf eyes see? It's just,
Yeah,
it's so funny.
yeah.
Taking it out of context, it sounds ridiculously
It's
racist,
racist,
but
yeah, exactly. Mate,
it's very funny.
Aragorn's getting cancelled. Um, he's getting cancelled after that. He's been real quiet since that was said. Um, yeah, and then I guess obviously we see them interact with Aomer, who's then introduced to the story, who will play a big role. Um, yeah, I love Aomer. Like he's a great character. Like Carl Urban, man, he is a ridiculously good actor. Like some of the roles he does. Um, yeah. What are your thoughts, I
I mean,
guess, on these sort of parts?
Aemir and Aemir and Aragorn's meeting is. I mean, it's quite symbolic because it's a meeting of these two very separate lineages of men.
Mm,
Aragorn being descended from the Numenorians, and Aemir being, you know, a son from the line of Rohan. And so it's quite a significant encounter, the despite I mean, it's the actual encounter itself is somewhat short, and it's somewhat tense because obviously Aemir doesn't know what to make of these strangers, and Aragorn is somewhat cagey, being surrounded by a bunch of angry horsemen with spears. But the significance of those lines sort of coming back together, and it's sort of like, and when you look at it in hindsight, realizing that that's like the beginning of the sort of, it's the beginning of the realignment of these two lines of men, and seeing that as like the start is, there's a large amount of significance behind that scene, like of latent significance that's like about to come into fruition. But at that moment, it's just not quite there yet. But you know it's coming, and
mm,
it's just it's in hindsight that scene just has like a lot of narrative weight behind it.
mm. And yeah, even if you think about it, like by the end of the third movie, Aragorn's the king of Gondor, and Aomer follows after Theoden in becoming the king of Rohan. And so, yeah, that's even, I guess, an interesting thing to think about. Um, and yeah, I guess even leading into it now, we even see like how, I guess, unique hobbits are in this movie in terms of when Aragorn was talking about them to Éomer, he had obviously never heard of hobbits. Um, I guess skipping forward, I'll just quickly add like Treebeard, who's the oldest living creature in all of Middle Earth, had never come across hobbits before. I guess it really shows how they like to keep to themselves. I guess
Yeah,
showing
well, I
like
mean,
this sort of
well,
lifestyle.
as well, the hobbits are fairly well isolated
Yeah.
from the rest of Middle Earth.
Mm,
You know, the region around them is very much bordered either by very very small communities or by the ruins of dead ones.
mm. Yeah, and I guess it even just goes to show like the fact that four hobbits go to play a massive part into saving Middle Earth is just it's crazy because like before that there was like a lot of people in Middle Earth would have asked what are hobbits, but then
Yeah.
by the end of the series it's like here you have like just sort of everyone bowing down to four hobbits in recognition of what they've done. Like it's a crazy journey along that storyline even as well. Yeah, and then I guess we see Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli sort of thinking that their two friends have been killed in this raid. Um,
Mm.
only for Aragorn to kick a bucket and break his toe in real life, of course. Had to mention that. So the scream he lets out is a real one. If you didn't know
Yes.
that, I'm sure if you've even watched Lord of the Rings and been around the community a little bit, you would have heard of that. But
Everybody just tends to freak out as soon as that scene happens.
you have to
It's
talk
just
about it.
it's
Every time that scene comes on, you have to talk about
yeah.
it.
Just pause the movie, go on a 10-minute rant about it.
Yeah, and then I guess yeah, like I said, we see Aragorn's crazy tracking skills, and we find out that Merry and Pippin have sort of run into Fangorn, and we see them come across Treebeard, who is an Ent. Now, Treebeard, I love the fact that it's like Gimli voicing him. um, but I just love Treebeard's character. Like, he's not necessarily a bad character, and at the start he's not necessarily like a good character. It's sort of just like, as he puts it, no one's on the side of like nature or the trees, so he's on no one's side. And I think it just adds that sort of grey aspect to the parts being played in Middle Earth. What are your thoughts?
I mean, the only person who could truly be said to be on the side of nature would have been Radagast, and he'd gone
Mm,
AWOL since the events of The Hobbit. It's mentioned, I think, when in the first book when they reach Rivendell that they tried to contact Radagast, but no one could find him, and he just completely disappeared.
mm,
Radagast, I probably just mentioned, was one of the he was one of the wizards that came to Middle Earth, so he was sort of like more or less like a brother to use that to Gandalf and Saruman,
mm,
but because he was a servant of Yavanna, who was the goddess of nature, his role was very much sort of like conservation and preservation of the natural wilderness. So during most of the events of Lord of the Rings, he just completely disappears, and it's left quite it's a matter of debate exactly where he was or what exactly happened.
mm,
It is interesting that, and it's also another thing to point out that when the Ents most needed a defender and someone to stand up for them, Radagast wasn't there.
mm. Yeah.
Um, and you could almost put that down to like it's like yeah, it's like, just going back to the idea of just like of Gandalf, Saruman, and Radagast. Like one of them, Saruman, um, corrupts his purpose. His purpose was to serve as a guardian and protector. He just tries to become a conqueror.
Mm,
And then Radagast sort of does the opposite. He gives up on his purpose because even though he was meant to be a protector of nature, he was also one of the wizards. But he gives up on that. He just disappears. It's only Gandalf that remains. That sort of remains true to his calling.
mm.
And in turn, it's Gandalf that is chosen to essentially replace Saruman and become the leader of the wizards or of whatever's left of them.
Mm. Yeah, and well, the two blue wizards we just never even really hear of.
Oh,
Yeah,
they're just an enduring mystery. There were two
yeah,
other wizards that came with Radagast, Gandalf, and Saruman,
yeah,
but
but
Saruman actually went because they went east of. I mean,
mm,
the east of Middle Earth. Tolkien always sort of describes it as a mystery. He doesn't. He never actually
mm,
explains quite what lies in the east. You know that there's another kingdom of men. There's also a massive lake like beyond Mordor that he mentions, the Sea of Rune, but he never actually gives much detail. And it's
mm,
known that the Blue Wizards went east and Saruman went with them. But Saruman then comes back west and he just never mentions what happened. So like, you could argue like theoretically he could have killed them.
kind of sus.
Or but given that there were two of them, it's unlikely. So it's an enduring mystery among
Mm,
Tolkien fans as to exactly what happened to them and what they did for just actually I should mention there is an interesting theory um about that, which is that I think it's based on some letters that Tolkien wrote, where the forces of like the of Rune and the other areas from the east, Saruman, because Saruman flees there for a time after leaving the west of Middle Earth. This is well before the events of Lord of the Rings, and he spends a long time there, growing in power, and then he returns. So the reason we see in the books he brings lots of like the men of Rune and all their Oliphants with them to sort of bolster his army, and the reason he's able to do that is because he spent so much time in the east of Middle Earth. And I mean, you think about that, that would mean that the men who lived in the east of Middle Earth actually were under Sauron's power for much, much longer than the men of Rohan, than the men of Gondor. So arguably, they actually had a much, much more difficult time than they did.
Mm.
And so it's been hypothesized that one of these the Blue Wizards did by going there was that they actually could have worked to undermine Sauron's influence, and that if it wasn't for their actions, Sauron would have actually been able to draw a lot more of the men of the East to his cause. But because the Blue Wizards are working against that, he actually had a reduced. He was able to draw far less than he originally could have.
Mm.
But again, that's just one theory. Maybe they were killed by Saruman. But I personally like the idea that the Blue Wizards were fighting their own battle against Sauron in the East, where it had been going on for much longer, and just working with the people there. I think it humanizes the men of the East in what I think is a far more satisfactory manner than
Mm.
how they're often presented.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting and plausible theory. Yeah, but like you said, again, the Blue Wizard's just a mystery. I guess just while we're on the topic of wizards, we see Gandalf. I guess Merry and Pippin come across Gandalf. It's not yet revealed to us at that moment that it's Gandalf.
Yeah,
They sort of try alluding to it being Saruman.
yeah.
But then when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli come through Fangorn, they then come across Gandalf, who then, we get to see that like Gandalf wasn't really dead, and we get the full picture of the epic battle between him and the Balrog, um,
Mm,
and sort of how Gandalf strikes him down, but then how he himself also passes out of time just to be
mm.
called back, sort of in the place of Saruman. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's a really interesting sort of detail they add there of how Gandalf sort of is Saruman, or at least what Saruman should have been. Um,
Mm.
yeah, and I
I mean,
love
if you'll permit me, there's a couple cool parallels that I wanted to sort of draw out from that. So
go for
if
it.
we take so so one of these ideas within like Christianity is you've got the image of Satan, and who was Satan? So Satan is originally an angel of God, who's referred to as Lucifer. Lucifer also actually serves as a title, and it essentially means I believe the Greek translation is morning star. I'm not quite sure, but the idea of the morning star is that when you in the night sky you have this one star which we now know to be the planet Venus that shines much brighter than all the other stars in the sky around it, and it shines much brighter before the sunrise. And the idea is it's sort of like it's a precursor to the glory of the sun. So the morning star is representing the glory of the sun outwards. Because I believe the reason for it shining so brightly is because the sun's light is bouncing off Venus's atmosphere. I'm not quite sure. My astronomy knowledge is unfortunately quite hazy. But and so you have this you have this star, and all its light, its glory comes from the sun. So it represents the sun because its glory is essentially a part of the sun. But of course, the story of Lucifer is that he becomes arrogant and he tries to shine in his own right. He turns away from God, and then and we can equate that with Saruman because Saruman is given. It's stated quite clearly. He was the strongest of all of the wizards. He was chosen as their leader because he was the strongest. He was the most
Mm,
powerful. So and his power is a reflection of the power of the gods because he is their servant and his power is drawn from them. So we have Saruman in almost a Luciferian. Saruman serving as a sort of Lucifer in this context. He serves as a sort of morning star, but of course he becomes corrupted. He becomes prideful and vain, and he tries to claim power on his own terms. He seeks to rule, but then, at least in terms of Lucifer, we then have the image of Michael, the archangel, who rejects the behavior of Lucifer and remains true to his purpose because he recognizes that his own power is only a reflection of that of God's. So then, Michael fights Lucifer. Lucifer cast down to hell. Michael, archangel. It's a pretty well understood story. So Gandalf somewhat serves as the Michael in this circumstance. He's the only one that stands up to Saruman.
Mm.
And he remains true to his purpose. But then there's another parallel here is the image of Christ, because Christ in Revelations refers to himself as the morning star. He refers to himself as Lucifer, which is a bit of an odd thing to say, because why would you have God calling himself Satan? That makes no sense. And the idea behind that is that Christ is also a reflection of God's power. His power is God's power, but he does not try to rule on his own terms. And because of that, he is in fact elevated above any power that Satan could hope to hold on his own terms. And he becomes the new morning star. He becomes the new sort of image of God. And I mentioned this because when Gandalf dies, he gets resurrected, and he gets resurrected from Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White. So he becomes the new Saruman.
More racist.
He essentially, yes.
Sorry, keep going.
So Gandalf becomes essentially, in this context, the new Morning Star, which is just this very, so Gandalf technically serves as a Michael and a Jesus figure in this moment, which is just it's a very interesting it's an interesting parallel that I hadn't quite realized for a long time. It only occurred to me recently that he technically plays the role of both these characters, and there's just a large amount of symbolism there that's really quite remarkable.
Anyway, I guess thank you for that.
Yes,
never really thought about it like
got,
that, but thank you for that. I guess symbolism.
I got completely sidetracked there.
We'll get back on track now. But yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, honestly, I reckon this episode will just stick to the side of no. I'm also gonna say, I guess we'll stick to the side of the Two Towers where, the sort of the Rohan Isengard arc, and because we're already like over 30 minutes in. So yeah, we'll just talk about that side, I guess, and then next time we'll talk about Frodo, Sam, and then Gollum, because that will.
Okay, fair enough.
Oh, we'll see how we're going, but at this rate, we're gonna be here a while. Anyway, continuing on. Yeah, so reunited with Gandalf, and then we sort of hear about how they're gonna, like, Merry and Pippin are fine, but now there's sort of this battle that's going to be waged with Rohan, and that's where Gandalf and the crew are going to head to next. And of course, here comes one of Tom's favorite characters, Shadowfax. I'll let you give your feelings about Shadowfax.
Shadowfax, if Gandalf's a human angel, Shadowfax is a horse angel. That's all that needs to be said. It's a horse angel. How much cooler could you get than that? The only thing that would have made it better is if he grew wings and started flying.
The Pegasus.
Yes.
Yeah. So we get introduced to Shadowfax, who becomes, I guess, a pivotal role in the storyline, like just overall. He gets to really show us the meaning of haste. But
yes.
Anyway, I guess we'll get back more into him, I guess, with that line in number 3 when we get to it. But yeah, no, we find out that, Saruman's been poisoning the mind of Theoden in Rohan. And yeah, I guess this is really where we get to see the treachery of Saruman. How he sort of has these sort of wild men convinced, these countrymen to convinced that Rohan stole their lands from them, and they're just running through, sort of destroying all these villages in the Westfold. Um, yeah, and it really goes to show the power and control of the situation Saruman has. Um, and even, with the king's son being killed. Um, yeah, and it shows sort of the dire desperation sort of Rohan's in, the dire need for help. Um, and yeah, I guess this is again where we get to see really Gandalf's newfound power show when he overthrows Saruman from control of Theoden. Um,
Well, before we get to that, I think we
yeah,
should just
go for it.
backtrack a tiny bit and just mention Wormtongue.
Ah, yes, yes.
It's quite significant, and also that's also when we get introduced to Eowyn. But
Mhm.
Wormtongue first. I always find it interesting that Saruman knew Theoden. They'd met. I mean,
Mm,
he mentions it before that they'd met multiple times.
mm,
But when it comes to trying to well poison his mind, so to speak, Saruman doesn't even bother to do that himself. He just uses Wormtongue to do it for him.
mm.
Um, Now, I think a lot of the blame for this kind of has to go to Théoden. When there's only one guy with black hair and slimy skin in your entire kingdom, and you're listening to him,
If he looks
listen,
evil, don't trust.
he's the only guy with black hair. Nothing wrong with having black hair, and he's like permanently oily and somehow still dry at the same time. Like that's not a good sign. But
Honestly, I have to give amazing amount of credit to the actor who plays him because he does it so well. He makes you like honestly just like sort of be disgusted every time you see him and just sort of have that hate.
yeah, well, it's like, and
Like,
it's like, and it's also like, why was Grima doing this? Grim, that's Wormtongue's first
yeah,
name. Like, Wormtongue doesn't actually. I mean, it's interesting because his motivation isn't actually to gain power. He's only doing this because he wants Eowyn.
yeah.
That's his entire motivation. Like, it's like Sauron manipulates Saruman's lust for power, and Saruman manipulates Wormtongue's just lust. Um, but it's interesting
Mm,
just seeing like the chain of manipulation just sort of like moving down. And you can even argue that even Morgoth manipulates Sauron's lust for power in the same way. But
mm,
it's just interesting seeing how that chain of it's the what I'm trying to say is that the sort of the levels of authority from like we have the image of like Boromir like leading his troops, for instance, in the battle for Osgiliath, which occurs before the events of the book. He does that out. He tries to lead them as a virtuous leader. He appeals to their sense of honor and duty. But the forces of evil aren't actually appealing to any of your higher virtues. They're appealing to your base desires,
mm,
and they're attempting to corrupt you. And it's interesting just seeing the differences in in leadership there. And it's a very interesting contrast between these two forces and how they sort of
mm.
manage their own followers and how they maintain control.
But I think what's even scarier in terms of Grima's manipulation, like when he's sort of talking with Eowyn and I guess trying to comfort her. The thing is, he's such a good manipulator that he actually makes her think and process the words he's saying, and almost, I guess, like she almost does give in, like I guess, like you could say, like you can see it. But then obviously she snaps back and basically calls him a snake. um,
Mm.
but yeah, like it does go to show that he's so good at twisting and manipulating his words that he can even sow those sort of seeds of doubt in Eowyn.
Well,
But
I mean, he learned from Saruman,
oh
who was
yeah,
the master of speech.
like yeah, especially in the books you see that more about how like sort of Saruman and his voice is so powerful at manipulating people. like even when they approach him later, Isengard. Yeah, but we really get introduced to this character of Grima in such a good way, and you just dislike him straight away.
Mm.
Like just everything about him. Yeah, and then we go to see obviously how he gets Éomer banished from the kingdom,
Mm.
and just how the sort of the grip and grasp he has on Theoden and control over him. Um, yeah, it's no, I guess, little feat. Um,
Oh no, not at all.
mm.
It's quite significant. It's a very significant. Well, I don't want to say achievement, but
um, Bad achievement. We'll chuck that into it.
yeah,
Um, yeah, and then now obviously, yeah, Gandalf comes along with the crew, and I think this scene doesn't really get given the full justice of where they get their weapons checked in the movies. Like in the book, like obviously Aragon had his sword, the reforged sword, obviously. And he was like not wanting to be parted with it at all. But then he ends up saying, "All right, I'll give it over, but if anyone touches it, they're gonna die." Like that's how protective he is of that. And then of course, even with Gandalf giving up his staff, um, I think it's Grimbold who's guarding the door and doing the weapons check. I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, but we sort of see his loyalty, his true loyalty to Rohan is sort of what eventually lets Gandalf in with his staff, knowing that Gandalf is there to help. Um, which yeah, I feel like the books just sort of helped go into more depth and give that scene a bit more justice. But um, yeah, it's pretty funny just seeing them all whip out like all the knives, swords they have. Yeah, I guess. Do you want to sort of lead into sort of the next part and talk about that?
yeah. I mean, that's Gandalf confronting Theoden, and when he's confronting Theoden, he's really confronting Saruman. Um, I mean, there's, I mean, you can draw the theme of like spiritual warfare there as well. Like, there's this idea that when you confront like someone who is morally corrupt, that you're not confronting like them, but you're also confronting like the darker spiritual power behind that as well.
Mm,
Um, and I feel like you could that idea could sort of be overlaid on what Gandalf does here because he approaches Theoden, the king, but in under the surface, he's also approaching Saruman, who's completely taken control of his mind and his will, and to the point of physically aging him.
mm, yeah, and yeah, I think it's. I love how they sort of show Saruman getting like sort of pushed back when. Well, firstly, when Gandalf reveals himself, taking off his cloak and having that like just bright white light being shown. But then also when Gandalf finally overthrows Saruman from Theoden's mind, we sort of get that visual of Sauron being thrown back in person.
Mm,
And then just the smoothest transition ever of um, Theoden going from this old, weak person to just sort of de-aging back into
yeah,
his stronger self. And then, of course, we are introduced to one of the greatest performances in the movie of Bernard Hill, um, and just the amazing performance he does of Theoden. Yeah, Theoden's he's such a good character in my eyes. Like, yes, he has his faults, but I think that's what also makes him a good character. Is that um, even though he is a king, he still makes mistakes, but he's able to admit when he's made those mistakes. But at the end of the day, it's still just the emotion and passion and love he has for his people is just what gets me. Um,
mm. Well, yeah, that's. I mean, it is significant. Like that's one thing that kind of separates a good leader from a I don't want to say a bad one, but a less competent one is how at least in terms of leading a people, is how invested are you in those people?
Mm.
Like, how much do you care about them? And Theoden, to his credit, holds them in he's very much a servant of the people in that sense. I mean, when they go to war, he's the one that leads the charge.
Mm.
So he always puts himself first. And I mean, like, it's easy to say, "Oh, that's amazing, how noble," but it's like it's considerably harder to actually do that.
Mm.
And the fact that despite all his flaws, which you've already alluded to, he still puts himself first anyway,
Mm.
is is quite significant. And I think it speaks to a level of I think it speaks to a level of virtue. I'd say it's a
Mm.
level of virtue in the character.
Yeah. And honestly, I'm upset that Aragon stopped him from killing Grima. The fact that Grima not only is spared, but like the fact they let him get away and get a horse and leave. Like, anyway, Aragon's a better man than me. Yeah, but you just get to see sort of the tide start turning through Theoden, I guess being brought back from being manipulated. And then, yeah, just it's so powerful seeing the funeral and sort of how he's mourning over the loss of his son. Like, just even the line of no parent should ever have to bury their child. It's just like the way it's delivered. Like, it really is an amazing performance
Mm. It's like
portrayed.
even when you've seen it before, it always
Oh,
just
always.
it's an extremely powerful scene.
Hmm. Which I
But I mean,
think you would come to appreciate it even more once if we ever become parents ourselves. Like, obviously,
mm,
as young adults with who aren't married and don't have kids, like we don't understand it fully. But
I feel like we identify more with the dead son than with
yeah, yeah, exactly. But like we don't fully understand that. But yeah, it still has that power to like affect us. That's how well he does the
yeah.
line.
I mean,
Yeah.
it also is even more like it's 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 even worse for him when you realize that he would have seen like Rohan wasn't isolated from the rest of the world. They would have seen like over the generations the fall of Arnor and how the three kingdoms just fragmented and
Mm,
how like an entire line of kings just disappeared. So I think he would have been aware of that, and he would have seen that like the kings of Gondor have more or less like just failed. Whatever's left of the North kingdoms disappeared. Those smaller kingdoms have also just died. So he would have seen all these all these kingships just disappearing. And when he's lost his heir, when he's lost the when he's lost his own son, I feel like it's not just the fact that he's lost. It's not just the fact that his son is dead, which is difficult enough, but he's also got the realization that it could be the end of his kingship as well.
mm,
Especially because he's seen that well, he'd have had that sort of recognition growing up that a lot of the lines of kings around of the neighboring kings had fallen, and that have been a level of I think that have been a part of him that would have been realizing that this might be what's happening to him,
mm,
and that would have been an added layer of just of grief and tension on top of just the simple fact that his son has been killed.
mm. Yeah, which is then I guess we sort of get to see him going into preservation mode of trying to protect the people and spare more loss of life by obviously fleeing to Helm's Deep instead of riding out and meeting Isengard head on, which I think in the end it was the right move to go to Helm's Deep because there was no way they were going to be able to take on all those forces of Isengard in sort of that open war. But yeah, also I guess the fact that we see Gandalf trying to provide counsel and wisdom to Theoden, and you sort of see him hesitant to receiving that. Obviously, you can't really blame the guy; he's just been manipulated by like a wizard, and like he's obviously going to be a bit cautious about that. But in the end, I think the right move was made. It worked out for them fleeing to Helm's Deep. Um, which I guess then on the way, we see that shorter battle between the Wild Riders and the Rise of Rohan, which then leads to Aragon being sent off a cliff,
Mm.
only for him to be sort of rescued by a horse, the Theoden's son's horse, who he released from, I guess, like the captivity of Rohan, which is just like a full circle moment. Yeah, which then results in him seeing.
It kind of feels like a form of karma in a way.
I guess, like, look, in terms of
I
Christianity,
mean,
it's
yes, I
just
agree.
you get what
It's
you
more
receive,
like
but
there's a parallel. There's a parallel. I feel like it's just a parallel idea.
yeah, which
I'm not trying to say Tolkien was trying to suggest this out,
yeah,
but I'm just
yeah, but I get what you're saying. Like, Aragon, like, did that for the horse, and the next thing, the horse comes and saves him. Um, yeah, and then I mean, obviously, it leads to Aragon seeing the army as well, which so that sort of worked out as like him getting thrown off the cliff. Also, like it
mm.
seemed bad, but it worked out for them
Yeah,
to
it's
know
like
what they're up against.
you have good results coming out of what are bad
Mm.
situations.
It comes from that
Uh,
idea, even in Genesis, when Joseph says, "What you meant for my evil, God meant for my good." I guess like it's a similar parallel of bad slash evil things happening, leading towards for the good of everyone. Um, yeah.
I mean, I'm just gonna point out as well. We go on about how amazing, like how powerful Saruman's voice is, but Christopher Lee's speech before the army,
Oh.
that was that is just wow.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
he.
just wow.
Yeah, again, so many perfect castings for the movies, but yeah, Christopher Lee, like, you just feel that sort of power in his voice, especially like when they first go out onto the balcony and you hear like the massive noise of like horns and cheering, and you see that massive army for the first time. You're like, yeah, it's crazy. And then even Grima having a tear come from his eye, like,
Mm-hmm. That was a good touch.
like,
That was
oh,
a very
like, as much as you hate it, it's like, oh, okay. Like, even he didn't mean for like this to happen. Like, he thinks that everyone's just gonna be killed and wiped off. But yeah, and then of course we come to the Battle of Helm's Deep, which, look, I know it's a lot of people's favorites, like in terms of battles. It's probably I don't know. I struggle to say it's my favorite, but then again, I struggle to say any battle is my favorite. It's because like they're all
yeah,
good and have their moments, but
yeah.
it is an iconic battle.
Look, there's definitely something special about the battle at Helm's Deep. Um,
Mm.
just this desperate last stand against you know your worst nightmare. I mean, I can't imagine anything much worse than an entire army of orcs and urukai just walking up to my door. Like that would be terrifying.
Yeah, and especially we really see the desperation of Rohan. Like they're super outnumbered here. Like they're
Yeah,
even
I mean, it's
getting
like I
young
mean,
boys and older men.
Gandalf points out as well. Like by going to Helm's Deep, you've essentially trapped yourself against the wall because the orc army is big enough to fill the entire passageway out.
Mm.
Like they completely surround the entrance.
Mm. But I feel like even if they were Edoras, like Edoras was not designed to be able to
No,
defend that.
No, I agree. I'm not saying that it's like that it was like
Mm.
the wrong choice, but
Nah, but yeah,
like
either way, they were in trouble.
Edoras would have if they said an Edoras, it would have just fallen
They
instantly.
would have lost for sure. Yeah, which
Yeah,
yeah, it's like there's no real right or good choice here. Like they're
yeah,
kind of in trouble.
yeah.
um, yeah, but
It was definitely a dark moment.
can you imagine being that orc, the Uruk-hai who marched all the way from
All the
Isengard all
way
the way
else to
just
get
to get
shot
shot
before
before
the
the battle
battle begins.
begins? Like
Look,
that
considering
would
what the rest of them considering what the rest of them would have to go through, he kind of got it easy.
fair, but also like, come on, like even that's cruel. um,
No, it is it is just extremely funny,
yeah, like
and also just like
true.
it's an extremely it's an extremely stressful moment, but it's also just so stressful that you
Mm.
can't help laughing
Yeah,
at the same
yeah,
time.
yeah, and I guess like even before we get into like the full depth of battle, like the elves showing up. Obviously, it wasn't a touch in the book, but I think it was a nice touch to add to the movies. We get to always see Haldir again, who we'd seen in
Mm,
Lorien, in the last movie. So yeah, I think it was a nice touch of having like those sort of elves and men working
yeah,
alongside each other again.
yeah,
Um,
like yeah, I've got nothing
yeah,
against it
yeah,
personally.
and then yeah, we see the witty banter between Legolas and Gimli first with the
Uh,
box of like Gimli not being able to see over the wall, and then of course when the battle begins, like them counting their kill count essentially. Like, could you imagine being in that battle and you just hear an elf and a dwarf yelling, "I want 70," like, or even just being at one of the Uruk-hai climbing up the ladder and you just hear a dwarf yelling like 4, 5, like that would be low key terrifying, but also just like what is going on?
yeah, no, it was just it. Look, if I got faced by Gimli on the field, I'd just run
Yeah.
because I know it's already over.
Yeah. Um, Especially, I guess, later on, when we see him and Aragon take on the whole like army essentially on the walkway.
Mm,
Um, which yeah, I guess we see more of the banter that Gimli has of no one tosses a dwarf, but then he needs Aragon to throw him over.
yeah,
Um,
but like it's also a level of I feel like it also speaks to a level of trust that they developed as
yeah,
well.
and I guess like
Like,
the understanding Gimli had gotten of himself,
mm,
like he almost fell in Moria, so he's learned his lesson.
yeah, he knows that it's not only that he needs to rely on people, but it's not just that he needs to rely on people, but also that he's got the right people to rely on.
Mm, mm.
Also, it's just very funny.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah. And I think, yeah, again, another interesting aspect of Helm's Deep, we see the sort of the use of an explosion, which, for them back then, they wouldn't have ever come across something like that of
Well, I mean,
that.
gunpowder gunpowder was actually used within Asia well before it got introduced to the West.
Mm,
But the usage of gunpowder in this specific environment, I mean, Sauron is, and I suppose you could say Morgoth as well to an extent, but Sauron's very much sort of he represents industry.
mm, yeah.
He represents that level of destructive innovation, and him, and of course him, and Saruman by extension, using gunpowder is a reflection of that.
Mm,
Um, it's the power of innovation turned towards destructive ends. I mean, innovation actually has a really interesting like historical. It's really interesting because historically there was a lot of like there was a strong suspicion of innovating. Like like you'll find like texts from people from the like the 15th from like the 1500s and earlier where they'd use the word like innovator as almost like an
mm,
insult. They'd be like, "No, I reject the title of innovator. You, sir, are the innovator. You are the corrupt one." And then you reach like, the Industrial Revolution and beyond, and then innovation kind of switches. It goes from this thing which is seen as suspicious to something that becomes sort of praiseworthy. And I mean, I'm not saying innovation's bad. Like, innovation has done amazing things for humanity, but I think you know there's also that level of the destructive potential of innovation is, I think, exemplified by Sauron and Saruman's forces, and
mm,
is perfectly encapsulated with that one Uruk-hai that essentially essentially kills himself to blow up the wall,
yeah.
which is, I mean, it's interesting. It's like the men of Rohan and Theoden everyone, even Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, are willing to die for their people, and
Mm.
the orcs are willing to die for their cause as well. But the orcs are driven by anger, greed, and even fear of their masters.
Mm.
And I mean, the men and elves are driven. Well, obviously there is a level of fear of death as well that sort of like is there as well, and also like obedience to authority. But there's also there's an emphasis on on their virtues and sort of fighting for the defense of others because they've got their women and children deeper inside the fortress and they're fighting to protect them. Whereas the orcs are willing to die only to continue to deliver further death and destruction.
Mm. Yeah. Um, yeah, I guess that's the real difference between the two in the end. Yeah, and I guess when, like, look on the bright side, when the wall does blow up, at least there was a lot of collateral damage to the orcs.
I mean, even that's another thing as well. Like
Yeah, there's
the
so
orcs
many.
didn't care.
Yeah, they
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 didn't
just they
care there
copped
was going
it.
to be collateral damage.
Yeah,
Like they were willing to sacrifice their own soldiers for that.
yeah, like it's crazy. Like you see the tactics on one side. Um,
Also, the one time Legolas needs to hit a shot, he doesn't.
he hit two shots. It's just
It
he
didn't work.
he was a beefy boy, you know. Like
That's also true.
he
That
was
was like the biggest one.
he was a very like the weird thing is like he was so beefy he didn't need armor. Like he was running out there, with no protection around the upper body, nothing,
Well,
just the helmet.
I think the idea was that like they would have put two and two together if he had you would have this massive guy in armor carrying a torch.
Hmm.
Although I always thought they had all that time with like the shields to just like bring like the bat around. They could have just used one of those, but you know,
Hmm.
it looks
That
much cooler when you have a
that
shirtless orc just running
that to be more
at the
dramatic.
wall.
That to be more dramatic.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but then I guess now we see this shift and sort of turning of the tides. Like we had Rohan sort of fending them off decently well, but then the wall blows up. We have the death of Haldir, unfortunately, and like you just sort of see all the lives that have already been lost, and then of course they have to
Mm.
retreat, and yeah, you feel like all is lost.
Yeah.
Um, and then again, it comes down to a last ditch effort, last ditch idea of just riding out to face the orcs.
Mm.
You know, probably gonna die, but Aragon suggests it, and
I mean,
Théoden.
the real question is how on earth did they get onto their horses in such a short amount of time?
I mean,
Just
they jump
it's one of the
cut.
questions that we still have no answers to.
They did the jump cut for us, but yeah, like they made it seem like a very very short time, but yeah, and then we see them ride out, and you're like, okay, like there's a chance, and then they get out, and you see how many is still left, and it's like,
Mm.
okay, there's no chance. But then, of course, enter Gandalf and Éomer and the Rohirrim, and yeah, it's just they come to save the day. We see Gandalf obviously using the flame of Arnor, which is referring to the sun, which I think was pretty cool, and like using that to sort of weaken the orcs' defense and whatnot as they sort of come charging down. Um,
At the very least,
yeah,
having the sun suddenly shine in your eyes is not pleasant.
especially for the orcs who hate the sun, but like for us, that'd
Mm.
be a pain. Yeah, and then we sort of see them retreat. The orcs now retreating, which now there's just a bunch of trees where they've come from, which there weren't those trees but there before. And of course, they are. I can't remember the name for it. It's in the book because they're not ants. Those ones. They're like the Hurons or something. I can't remember. Could be wrong. Um, which of course we saw them get sent there earlier when um, Treebeard, of course, decided you know time to go to war against Saruman and Isengard. Which that scene where Treebeard like sort of comes out of the clearing to see all those trees been sort of burnt, cleared, and whatnot. Like you can hear the sort of the sadness and pain in Treebeard's voice. Like you genuinely feel sad for some trees we didn't know. Like it's done really well. And then the sort of the last march of the Ents thinking they're gonna be going out. Um, but yeah, again, it's just even that whole battle scene of the Ents just obliterating the leftover orcs at Isengard. And I
I
guess
mean, on that note, I want to
yeah,
pause for a moment because there's
go
something
for it.
there that I want to tease out, and I really want your opinion on this
All right.
specifically. Like, we have the image of Theoden, Aragorn, what remains of the men of Rohan, riding out of Helm's Deep to meet the orcs head on in this like last ditch attempt. We have the image of Treebeard leading what remains of the Ents against Saruman in a last ditch attempt. So
Hmm.
I feel like this image of like the there's this image of like the last ditch attempt, and the way that it's framed,
Hmm.
it's essentially valorizing it. It's saying it's to sort of break it down into really simple languages, but I feel like it's trying to communicate that it's better to go up against impossible odds and die trying
Hmm.
than to not try at all. And
Hmm.
I mean, I'm curious as to what you make of that idea.
Well, I mean, it's even like, when your back's to the wall, you got like, I guess what seems to be like nothing left. I guess that's where you really find out what you're made of, sort of what you got left. I think that's even just a thing in life. Like, when you're sort of going through challenging times, that's really when you see what, like, what your character is like. When you go through the good times, that's all well and good, but it's when you go through those challenging times, that's when you get an understanding of, how far can you push through these times. And really that's just, I think, symbolism there of that. Um, even like, I guess, underdogs in like sport teams and just things like that, when you've sort of been ridden off, you can play with a new sort of freedom almost. Like,
Mm.
yeah, I think that's really sort of
I
what's
feel like
being pushed.
I feel like you're kind of suggesting the idea that like once you take away everything from someone, you've essentially set them free because now they have nothing to lose.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Um, but I guess like there are those who would collapse and cower, I guess, like sort of just give in those situations. But those who fight through those situations come out stronger on the other side. Um, yeah, so that's really the sort of the image and sort of like, yeah, sort of what I see being painted through these sort of themes. Um,
Well, I mean,
yeah,
here's a bit of a bit of an here's another take on that though, which I'm really curious to see what you make of this.
yeah,
What do we say in terms of the people that do fight but that don't come through the other side? I mean, we have Haldir who falls in battle. We have Theoden's son who's I don't know why I cannot remember his name. It's just not coming to
Thengel.
me.
No, Thengel's his dad. Theodred. Theodred.
Yes, like Theodred falls in battle and he didn't like cower towards the end. So what do we if the message is that if
I
we
mean,
fight
even
through the
Boromir.
yes, Boromir as well. I mean, how could I forget Boromir? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but like I'm just curious. Like if we have this message that fighting through to the end is like it's like the right choice and that's what sort of like gets you through. What do we say in terms of those who don't get through? Because even if we extrapolate that to like our perspective, there's going to be like many who just don't get through, not because they were weak, but because they just get killed essentially,
Mm.
for lack of a
Well,
better.
the thing is, like, even those, like, even with Boromir, like, yes, he ended up dying, but really, in that final moment, even when he had arrows already piercing his chest, he could have easily just given in and would have been like, yeah, okay, he's been pierced. But he went and showed the extent and power that he had in him to keep fighting, and really sort of redeemed himself almost as well, like after, just trying to take the ring from Frodo and being corrupted in that sense. And really, look, if it, like, all right, just putting it back sort of in terms of our lives, like when we go through challenging times and we aren't fit for the task, or we end up getting knocked down because it's been too much in life and we are struggling, we can still learn through that experience, I guess, to an extent. Um, and we're not perfect. We're gonna struggle. We're gonna fail. But at the end of the day, it's not just the right choice of sort of fighting through these moments. It's the harder choice. It's a lot easier. Like, it would have been a lot easier for Boromir just to give in, after we got shot, or like once or even twice. It would have been easier for, like, just, yeah, really everyone else in those situations to give in, but instead they fight through, and whether they're successful or not, it goes and shows just the courage that they have, in my opinion at least. That's just how
Mm.
sort of I have my take on it.
It's the character that matters, not the outcome.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Um, because look, outcome isn't always in our control. Like,
Mm.
that's even just in life. Like, we're not in control of our lives or the outcome necessarily. Like, there are going to be things that happen to us without us being controlled at. Obviously, as a Christian, I know God's in control. I know He's sovereign over the outcomes of my life. But me, myself, I do not necessarily live my life trying to achieve certain outcomes. I live my life with the purpose of walking alongside God and sort of growing and getting to know Him more, which at the end of the day is the only thing that matters for me in this life. Um, yeah, we've gone on a massive tangent, but sweet. Um,
It's an important tangent.
yeah, it is.
This is
It
what
is.
this is
Yeah,
what like a good story should do, is that it makes you reflect on your
yeah,
own beliefs, and it sort
yeah.
of and it encourages you to think about yourself in your own life. That's the mark of a good story. That's how fiction shapes reality.
Hmm.
And the fact that Lord of the Rings, the books, the movies are able to do that here is a testament to how to just what great pieces of work they are.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure, for sure. I guess just to sort of close out our discussion, because we're now an hour and 12 minutes in. Um, yeah, like, just we get to see obviously the victoriousness that both
Does that
outcomes.
work?
I don't know.
Victoriousness.
I'm trademarking it. It's my word now. Um, yeah, I guess, like, with the Ents coming out on top, especially, mate, the Ent that was on fire. Thank goodness the dam came down and flowed through, and he got to that water and put out that fire. Like, every time my heart races when I see him run into the water.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then we just have this moment of victory and triumph before we're then left off at the end of the movie with Gandalf, Theoden, Aragon, and all them overlooking towards Mordor, and how this was just one step, like one small tiny battle in the outcome of the greater, bigger war. Um, yeah, which obviously we haven't yet discussed the other half to this movie, but yeah, that's sort
Well,
of
the
where
other
that
third,
heart.
really.
Sorry?
'Cause,
Oh,
well,
yeah,
we haven't
yeah,
discussed
yeah.
or anything to do about Frodo and Sam and Gollum
Yeah,
yet.
yeah, because I'd say they do still have a big part, but yeah, they do sort of
Oh,
take the back seat.
absolutely.
They take the back seat a little in this movie. Um,
Frodo and Sam have plenty of Gollum coming in, and that's
oh,
extremely significant.
yeah, Gollum, just, mate, Andy Serkis, everything he does with Gollum is just amazing. The way he brought that character to life, which we'll leave for next time. Um, any last sort of things you want to add?
No, not really. I think if I add anything, we're gonna go on another 30-minute tangent. So I'm just gonna I'm just gonna not say anything.
Look, we can go to an hour and 45 minutes if you want, but nah.
Are you sure that you want to do that though?
Mate, I'm cooked. I'm so tired. I've been struggling this episode, but anyway, it's fine. That's
You've done very well. Thank you for
that.
putting up with my
Oh no,
extended rants.
it's all good. Yeah, no, but that's why we've done this episode, just because I don't think I have the capacity at the moment to do anything else. But um, yeah, well, I hope again you enjoyed this conversation. The sort of the rants, the tangents we go on with Lord of the Rings. Yeah, hope if you've watched this all in one sitting, then mate, you're an absolute warrior. You must really love our voices, but no, I hope you've enjoyed it overall. Yeah, hope you enjoy the rest of your day. I don't think the next episode will necessarily be continuation of Lord of the Rings. Again, this will just be something we do when we have nothing else planned. Um, yeah, I hope to have another episode of the podcast out soon. Yeah, thanks again, Tom, for coming on.
No, thank you. Thank you.
All good, but yeah, until next time, see you later.